De Agroecologia da Embrapa Amazônia Oriental, vice-presidente norte da Associação Brasileira de Agroecologia, e tenho a satisfação de realizar, em conjunto com o Centro Internacional de Pesquisa Agroflorestal, ICRAF, esta instigante sessão.
I'm very happy to organize CRAFT, a agroecological research organization. The idea of organizing this session with GLF in order to incentivize and share the regional reality to keep the Amazonia from going over the tipping point. This appeared out of the need to integrate the fascinating developments of the ways of life of the inhabitants of Amazonia before European domination, the way in which indigenous peoples and current populations live together and reproduce in current reality expressed in archaeological and anthropological research that's been done recently, and the stories of different subjects from different territories occupied by indigenous peoples and traditional populations in an integrated way in the developments of construction of an agroecological construction that can help to the reality of the Amazonic zone, considering ecology as a social movement, a transdisciplinary science, and all of them acting together and taking advantage of different dimensions of ecology, as will be mentioned. Evidence point out that throughout the centuries, many peoples evolved in this context, reconciling their support, sustenance, and reproduction with preserving the functions of the Amazon ecosystem. This, through recent and current technologies, shows us actual and possible examples of this living together that should be better studied, systematized, and considered as a way for reconciliation between agriculture and the needs for environmental preservation, and generate incentives for politics at different scales that allow to expand them with characteristics compatible to the biodiversity of the Amazon, and that should be considered as relevant in the different international conventions associated with the United Nations associations, such as the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Convention on Climate Change, and others. And so we managed to bring together within this virtual space the speakers who represent relevant segments to the collective constructions of knowledge under this line that will help us answer questions about the contributions of each one of the topics in discussion, as we can see. Before the presentations, I have a piece of information. I'm saying that it wouldn't be fair to be limited in this group of talks without having the opportunity to issue and ask and answer questions and get the answers. So please use the session chat to ask your questions. Preferably say who is the question for, and after the end of the session the questions will be sent to the respective speakers or the moderator, who will answer them, so that these answers will be available in the chat during the last day of the forum on the Thursday the 23rd. To start our presentations, we will first call Eduardo Goes Neves, a professor from the University of Sao Paulo, and he works in the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. We will start a long trip through time through the fascinating discoveries that he's going to talk about. Let's go with you, Eduardo. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Tatiana, for your invitation and the effort you made to organize this cross-disciplinary session that brings different perspectives and contributions to this very important debate. In my case, we search for a connection between the past and the present in the Amazon and its future. When we think about archaeology, the image that comes to mind is a distant or remote past in the case of Amazonia due to a series of reasons related to the history of Amazonia. Archaeology has always been linked to discussions about the past, but also archaeologists have tried to participate in discussions that have to do with contemporary topics, and they talk about possibilities for the future of the Amazonia. What I would like to say is to paint a picture of this history of occupation. What is the legacy of the traditional peoples, the indigenous peoples, and the population, the people from the jungle along the Quilombolas River, which are the Afro-American areas, and also the type of initiatives that have to do with the preservation of this biocultural patrimony that's so rich in Amazonia. It's also important to mention that in Amazonia there were approximately 10 million indigenous people living in the Amazonia at the beginning of 16th century when Portuguese and Spaniards came to Amazonia, and what happened in the first 2 centuries of conquest. It's a very violent process against the population that has to do with slavery, the wars of extermination, and infectious diseases that lead to a drastic reduction of population. Calculated around 90% of the population of Amazonia died during the first centuries of colonization. During the 18th century, when the first scientists started to travel through Amazonia, they described a scarcely populated area covered by forest everywhere. In this image of an Amazonia that's empty and covered with jungle was consolidated in the intellectual tradition of the West. And until now, that's the vision that permeates the vision that Amazonic countries have about the Amazons. Empty areas with few people, and this prevailed during the military dictatorship, land without people. But archaeology shows a very different history, and this is the history I'm going to tell you. We know that there are people living in Amazonia at least 2,000 years, and from recent papers, we know that the most ancient Rupest art also appeared in Amazonia. These peoples that occupied the Amazon as of 2,000 years, from the very beginning, they had activities with schemes of management, modification of nature. Some plants that are consumed today, such as castaña de Parao, castaña de Amazonia, were consumed in an archaeological site in Pará, which is the painted cave where we have evidence from 2,000 years ago. And this management, this modification of nature and the landscape were consolidated throughout time. About 6,000 years ago, we started to see the formation of a type of soil that's very typical of Brazilian Amazonia, but it also exists in other parts of Amazonia, in Colombia, called black soil or black Indian soil, very fertile soil filled with nutrients that have great stability that are now used as a resource by the indigenous populations and traditional populations near the rivers. And this is stable soil. They don't lose their strength. They maintain their fertility after many years of being formed. Another important thing is that Amazonia is a center for management of plants. Amazonia is a very important center for domestication of plants. Some plants consumed all over the world, like yucca, cacao, or peanuts, on the shores of the Amazons. After their domestication, after the arrival of the Europeans, cacao came from Amazonia and went to Europe and other parts of the world. What does archaeology show us? That it's a center of production of water and biodiversity. A series of important plants were domesticated and cultivated in the Amazonia, and these practices of production of agrobiodiversity of these traditional populations changed the landscape, modified nature, and created the Amazonia that we now know. I don't have time to talk to you about it, but have botanic information that show that the species of tree that's most common in the Amazons, that's in a list, the list there's 27 species of trees, uh, show plants that we consume currently, like acai of the Serengeti jungle, Tucumán, and many others. And the message that I would like to leave with you is the following. The history of the indigenous presence in the Amazon is very ancient. This relationship of ancient people with Amazonia, the peoples of the jungle, were always of transformation and production of agro life through agroecological strategies. They are very old strategies that led to creating the Amazonia that we now know. And what the contrast with the recent occupation of the last 40 years of the Amazonia that's had destruction of 20% of Amazon, but this destruction didn't generate wealth, it didn't produce, it destroyed this agrobiodiversity, and it's only generating wealth for current people. So talking about the past, present, future of Amazonia, we cannot separate the preservation of Amazonia from the existence of traditional people's ancestral knowledge, fundamental, but the practices that created these landscapes are essential. There's no future for Amazonia if we separate the natural history of Amazon and the history of the peoples that inhabit this very important region for almost 12,000 years. This is my message, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Eduardo. Now we go from archaeology to anthropology, and we will go to current times in the ways of life of indigenous peoples in traditional populations through the narration of Mauricio Augusto from Museum Mauricio Meneghetti from the program of preservation and cultural program of that institution. Mauricio, you have the floor. I would also like to say hello to everyone sharing this session with me, and I want to thank the invitation of Tatiana to participate with this anthropological contribution in this very important discussion for the future of the Amazon. Since they came to South America thousands of years ago, the indigenous peoples developed their own ways of living and dying in Amazonia. This long duration living together with the jungle created different and varied ways of languages, cosmological, with a very high wealth. Only in the Brazilian Amazonia live 170 indigenous people, indigenous town. They each developed their own knowledge about the world, their own theories about the ecosystems and the complex relationships of different beings amongst them. Their philosophy allows them to interpret and construct their different worlds without separating what we separate as Occidentals, nature on one side, everything that's not human, and culture on the other side of a human domain, exclusively on the quite the contrary. The native people say that nature and culture are not separate. There's an interaction between the jungle, humans, animals, and minerals and other beings, including the so-called spirits. They all have capacity in this world, cosmovisions, and their own policies. During the last decades, anthropology has made huge efforts to describe these native philosophies in Amazonia, especially after the reflections from Leris in his book Wild Thinking from 1982. He proved that the way of thinking of native peoples have their own logic that's equivalent to scientific knowledge. From there, many studies have followed this path in Amazonia, mainly with inter and transdisciplinary approaches with the knowledge of the indigenous peoples. This is how anthropology, archaeology, and ethnoscience together have reviewed a bit of the indigenous knowledge of this biome, articulated and preserved through agroforestal management and systems of classification of species, and also the connection between mythology, rituals, and knowledge transmission. I will give you an example of the cosmology of 23 indigenous peoples of Rio Negro, the Aruac, Ucano, and Naruk. They have been widely studied since the end of the 19th century. The ecosystem of the Rio Negro basin is complex because of its oligotrophic characteristics. The rain cycle influences the variation of the water level together with the high level of acidity of the river generate a low supply of food compared to other rivers. And from land that Magatinga, Amazonica, Magatinga, and vegetation that's different in that variation of vegetation that lives along this river network. This habitat during millennia of occupation, not only culture, hunting, and fishermen, but also forestry exploitation. The human influence is seen in the landscape as the case of yucca. It's known as cultural patrimony, and the large number of soils of the so-called Indian black soil are added to the huge knowledge of the Indians, of the natives, about nature. Even being a region of ancient colonization, the ecosystem of the Rio Negro River, this based on the native peoples that inhabited it from remote times, because it summarizes a holistic understanding of its territory, which are the essential source of the maintenance, reproduction, and existence of human and non-human beings. For the native peoples, the territories are formed in general by living things and inanimate things, water, rocks, soil. In this sense, territory is defined by the dynamic reciprocal relationships of peoples and their subgroups, but also between them and natural and supernatural environments. Its territory built and organized cosmologically by the influence of stars and constellations that mark the yearly cycle of life. This holistic approach, the Indians call it the management of the world. The situation of the indigenous peoples, and I gave you this example of the Rio Negro, but it's general. The situation of the indigenous peoples in Brazil is of great vulnerability, challenging policy managers to recognize the complexity in the elaboration and execution of public policies promoting the socio-cultural context of each indigenous people by locating the ubiquities that still exist. The sustainable character of indigenous lands should be one of the main policy instruments, allowing communities to have development based on their own models and acknowledgement of the adversity and reaching the free determination of each people. Under this assumption, starting 2007, under the government of Lula, they started the construction of public policy focused on the sustainability of indigenous land, the national policy for management of indigenous land, which was based on legal references from the Convention 69 of International Labour Organization, also based on indigenous protagonism. These policies worked in different ways. Indigenous leaderships worked in the construction of interministerial work. Indigenous leadership also participated in the surveys, and people from all the area participated in this process. In July 2012, Venegat was instituted by decree. The first article of this decree, the Negat, has as its objective to promote and guarantee the protection, recuperation, preservation, and sustainable use of indigenous land and territories, guaranteeing the integrity of indigenous territory, the quality of their life for the physical and cultural preservation of indigenous peoples, recognizing their socio-cultural autonomy in current legislation. The statement that PNGAT should respect the socio-cultural autonomy of the indigenous peoples. They have to respect their own ways and also the native theories about their traditional territories. This policy will turn 20 years in 2020, the one in 2022, and they have allowed to develop several plans of management in indigenous land with great learnings. Everything that I've said so far indicates that the respect to autonomy of indigenous peoples and the institutional support by providing the human resources that are necessary is a strategic decision for the future of the Amazon. It is a contribution that science, anthropology, and others can give to the future of this very important region, of this very important biome. This is my contribution, and thank you again very much for your invitation. Marcio, thank you very much for talking about the current situation of the native peoples, and when we begin the series of talks about representatives of local peoples, I'm glad to introduce to you a representative from the Guarani people from Bolivia, Marcian Kundari, the executive director for the Foundation in Multilinguistic Context and Pluriculturality PREP Fund, and honorary member of the Network of Indigenous Communities and Communities from the Integral School of Chaco from the René Moreno School, and currently she is the leader of multicultural and plurilingual education and institutional strengthening of the Pluricultural Institute of Culture. Thank you, Marcia, and now you have the floor. Good afternoon from the Plurinational Institute of Studies of Language and Culture. Receive our greetings and my thankfulness for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. In order to talk about the experience of the indigenous peoples regarding the use of their land for the production and preservation of the environment and of their cultures, it's necessary to start with understanding the importance of the land for the indigenous peoples. The land for the indigenous peoples is a political, social, economic, and cultural space. The territory is everything for the indigenous peoples. It's like a huge home where they reproduce themselves, where they establish relationships and develop their individuality. Within this logic, it's not only understand the territory as a space, but understand the territory as something that is alive, where everything is interconnected. You have the human relationship with living beings and with nature. Within the framework of the territory, the land is considered also as something that is alive. That is why plants grow in the land. Life, for the life of the indigenous peoples, the land is essential because from the land they obtain their nourishment. Since the land is alive, it needs to regenerate, and this means the importance that it has, preserving it and protecting it. This conception that the territory and the land are alive is based on the philosophical principle of life, and therefore the responsibility of human beings is to protect the territory and the land. But what has happened in recent times? With the Industrial Revolution, the territory and the land have been fragmented. Now we are seen as resources only to provide wealth or economic revenue. There is no special care. With agroindustry, there's a monopoly over land, over crops. They have promoted monocrops and production. They have minimized biodiversity by crushing small producers. And just like they have fragmented the land, they have also fragmented knowledge, the knowledge of the indigenous peoples, because the new generation doesn't know how to produce in a natural way the way our grandfathers did. Our grandfathers produced without agrochemicals and they consumed healthy nutrients. They were healthier. They protected the land. They let land rest with crop rotation. It's important that all of us and the new generations recover the integral vision of the territory. Let's recover the natural way of production without agrochemicals, without affecting the environment. To recover the lost knowledge, the knowledge that have been torn from us, recover the experience of crop rotation, the exchange of seeds in order to promote the recovery of biodiversity, to promote the care and the preservation of land, because when we protect the land, we also protect and preserve culture, knowledge, identity. We revitalize the indigenous languages because there are words to refer to each product, to each seed. And so if we recover seeds, we can also recover the names of each seed or product in the indigenous languages. So with this, I want to say that nothing is separate. We have to see the territory and the land as one total thing, that there is a relationship between thinking, territory, culture, and knowledge. Regarding policies and incentives to promote traditional systems, I believe that from the perspective of education, it's very important to promote and recover the systems of indigenous knowledge through community social productive projects that now in Bolivia with 070 law we are promoting in educational communities. One of the purposes of this education law is to contribute to the harmonic sharing and balanced sharing of human beings with Mother Earth. Also, it's also necessary to identify the vocation and productive potential of the region or the indigenous communities and develop a pedagogical working plan for the technical training. In Bolivia, we're now developing the formation of high school students not only at humanistic level but also at technical level in order to contribute to living well, to good living for the whole community. There are also different production systems for agriculture and forests that are being developed in our country under the agroecological approach. And we have family agriculture, territorial management, which contribute to food security the adaptation to climate change. I believe that all of these experiences in our country and also in other countries that have this experience, they should be recovered through different spaces. In our case, I believe that we should recover through educational spaces, of information spaces, so that we don't have a break and separation of community life and community education with scholarized education or university education or higher education, because for the indigenous peoples, education has become an instrument for fighting, or an instrument for reivindication, for exercising the collective and individual rights. That's my contribution from Bolivia. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Now let's travel in time and space and go back to Brazil. And let's listen to the presentation of a representative of a native community in San Juan from Isla de Marajó, current vice president of Memorial Chico Mendes, the activist People's Council, Nazare. Thank you, Edel Nazare de Moraes. Thank you so much, Tatiana, and thank you to all of you who are present here. Thank you for this presentation. I've listened to everyone, and well, it was nice to be able to hear all of you guys. So now let me share the screen with you. I am from a community from Marajo in Amazons. It's well, I'm a black woman from the rainforest, and let me tell you the story that once upon a time a friend came to our community, and he looked at my house and our garden, and he asked my father, "Since when you practice the agroecology?" And my father answered that, "Well, I don't do that. This is the way I live." So this dialogue, this story was to show you that us people who know the earth and who live on the earth, in the first place, as we said, the earth is a place to live. Is what the rainforest gives us, what the earth gives us, what the river gives us. The earth is a territory, and a very important issue is that the land use is not linked to great scale production. It is the guarantee of our life and of our lives. It is the territory that has a life space, visible and invisible. It's interconnected system in the whole environment where human beings and non-human beings interact. It's like a body. In the body, all the organs are important, and we are one of them. As a part of this integrity of this environment, it's a space of experimenting, of improving these territories. The conservation, the aromas, the flavors, we pass them from one generation to the other with this reciprocity where human and non-human beings live together in harmony but also in conflict. For us, the conservation without social inclusion does not exist, and just in that right moment, the way to look for and to find traditional knowledge must be based on a guarantee in the first place of the traditional communities. What I mean by collective territories, the extractivist activities, the exploration, it's the whole existence, one of those ancient practices. This sustainable extractivism with the whole such vast biodiversity in terms of water, earth, and air. After 500 of destructive colonization, we insist on our right to live, preserving and keeping our environment and practicing the agriculture without ending up with the earth. The production the destructive production destroys the environment because what they are looking for is for today's profit and not about the future. So also what I wanted to mention is that the guarantee of the land and the territory in ecological on ecological level is related to different cultures and religions to guarantee the right for those communities to be respected and included on a social level. Yes, we it is not necessary to see the indigenous peoples as the saviors of the country, of the motherland, but as active participants that participate in circular economy, and also it is important to transform the culture of those communities into commodities without violating their human and personal rights. Also, we should pay respect to such areas such as health, economy, society, and so on. Those cannot be private because those are based on traditional knowledge and traditional teachings of traditional communities. Thank you so much. Thank you for such a vast, deep vision about the importance of the territories in the region. We know that it is important. This subject is so important. And once again, let's travel to Brazil to with the participation of Angela Chiquenoy, who is a community leader of Pedemonte Amazonia region in Putumayo. He is working on a community project on this territory. He is a delegate since 2010, alongside with the Ministry of Interior. He participates in the process of uh, the region of Putumayo. Please, Angel, you have the floor. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to share this space with you and to be able to share our life experience as an indigenous community in such an important space as Valle de Sepundoi in the Putumayo department in Colombia. This valley is quite significant territory because it is a part of the Putumayo Basin, and this basin of Putumayo is one of the most important sources that feed the Amazon River. It is a very rich area because we have a lot of water, and I believe that this whole exercise of our rights of the spaces where the water is born, of the paramos, of the lands where medicine plants grow. It's a step to our harmonization in a spiritual sense and in terms of territory for indigenous peoples. Besides that, I wanted to mention that in 2010, we were noticed that the area where I am from was in risk due to different minery and electricity projects on. So when we realized that, we were able to organize ourselves internally and to rescue all the principles of conservation, of safeguarding this territory. And we were able to offer to the state a proposal in order to make our territory rights visible and for the government to respect them. So this great cultural and spiritual richness of our valley. As I was saying, this valley is a transition zone between the mountain and the river. It's a quite fragile area in a symbolic sense and in a physical sense, so it's quite important for us to be able to protect it. And I would like to pay your attention to, for you to pay attention to the following, that we have developed a methodology that helps our communities to preserve their lands and also to share the technical studies that usually are performed by the state bodies. So it all helped us to give a step forward in terms of our territories, but also to learn as indigenous peoples to learn those tools that made us richer inside and outside, and that helped us to to encompass this whole territorial subject. And the preservation of the rainforest is the preservation of life. This territory represents life, and if it's not well preserved, if it's not protected, our life is in danger. So it is important to keep it in mind, this fundamental principle, and also to generate proposals of own development, our own traditional ways of production, our own ways to strengthen ourselves working. Everything related to this traditional production scheme, to live, to enjoy, to reproduce ourselves, to be on this territory without affecting it, being coherent in our life in a proper way in terms of management of the territory and the conservation of this territory. So this process let us save quite significant territory. The paramos are located on this in this area, so this led us to have the whole connectivity with the mountains and also with the Amazonian rainforest. Those are two quite important areas for our life preservation. And I wanted to say that we've got the territorial titles. We are in the process of the the beginning of the paperwork, preparing the necessary documents in order to protect those lands, to preserve life, to understand that the territory is natural, the territory is cultural, because we as indigenous peoples, we exist on those territories and we have to use it correctly. And the most important, it is spiritual. And I believe that this word spiritual encompasses the whole knowledge, the whole teaching that for us, that this territory represents for us. So that's all I wanted to share with you. I believe it is a very nice experience where we could work with different actors such as government and ourselves, and to be able to manage and protect our territory. Thank you so much, Angel. It was very important to hear about the territory and the relation to cosmovision. So now let's go back to Brazilian part of Amazonia and to talk about agroecology. Now let's introduce Miss Palma, who is a special educator in Mato Grosso State, and she represents the agricultural and agroecological side, and also traditional communities, National Association of Agroecology. Thank you so much. Please, the floor is yours, Fran Paula. Hello to everyone. I'm so grateful for this invitation. I'm grateful for being able to be a part of this exchange. I represent Quilombolas women from Mato Grosso State. So this discussion related to agroecology is also related to our traditional practices. So the practice developed by traditional peoples, quilombolas, the indigenous peoples, is represented as an efficient way to manage the systems. Those are the ways of use that are like agricultural genius that has been developed during so many years. We are related to the culture, to the peoples, and we have this direct link with the territories. And talking about the preservation of Amazonian biodiversity and the existence of the peoples, it is a continuous process of domestication of the species, animals and plants. So those are traditional territories, those are responsible people that are responsible of maintaining this rich genetic flow among the families, among the communities, and among the peoples themselves. So this allows us to have great diversity in a food sense. So based on local actions to face the climate change, we have developed unique agricultural practices that have been preserved for so many years, although some of them are not being accepted, are not visible, and even criminalized. It represents a way of living for us and represents this interrelation between humankind and nature, where we use a lot of different management practices in order to ensure the access to food, to the access to biodiversity on a local level that is sustainable. And now we can show important aspects in terms of time, the management, the agricultural richness and productivity and biodiversity. And this is the result of those traditional agricultural practices. And it is also important to mention the role of women in those practices during several generations. Those women adopt good practices in terms of unique agricultural systems. It ranges from the knowledge of the seeds, plants, vegetables, plants, animals, and so on. In case of Quilombolas, the women have very important, significant practice that is called mushiru, and it is related to harvesting and preparation of the food. And while we are an agricultural society that is incorporated within this system, and regardless the communities, those practices are always preserved by the women. They are the principal actors in this resistance to chemicals and chemical substances. It is a big step for agro-business, the one that sees the Amazon rainforest as a huge market. Such a hectic use of the area and the climate change as a consequence. Today, the the rainfall has affected the availability of water for our communities. I would like to mention the factors that make those traditional practices possible, associated, for example, with the cultural area. It is important to observe those areas of harvesting and also to respect the earth times and to consider the ecological balance of this biome. And there are areas that are disappearing due to the loss of territories that used to belong to quilombolas or other indigenous peoples. So also this extensive use of toxic chemical substances, all those practices are disappearing, and this is one of the goal of our project, and we would like to share with you a link so that you can see it yourselves. And it is important to see the loss of those practices as a violation to human rights. There are many communities that suffer because of the introduction of electrical stations and hydrodynamic stations that do not only not guarantee the food safety and security, but also they change completely the social process in this that take place in this territory. And well, here we are in this meeting, in this table, acknowledging our traditional agricultural practices of those peoples that show us the way to harvest in a sustainable way in the future. So we have to understand that this is not only the local impact, but also a global one in terms of territories and their protection, the regulation of quilombolas areas. It is a guarantee of maintenance of those agricultural practices and a guarantee of the rights of those peoples. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this information and very deep glance to your state. Well, not only your state, but all the states of Amazonian rainforest. And now, let me introduce Mr. Jaime Sousa. He represents Brazilian Agroecological Association, and he's vice president of this association, and he used to be president. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank you for this invitation and thank Tatiana for organizing this table, this panel. As previous panelists already mentioned the role of agroecology and of ancestral knowledge and teachings that have been present in Amazonian area for 1,000 years is considered since a long time ago. So this is the main idea that we want to mention here. We must learn from them. We must bring innovations and to understand those different areas. So if we guarantee the rights of those peoples, it would mean the existence of Amazonian biome. As we always say, Amazonia has its people that work, that build their future, the future of the next generation. So in this moment, this possibility is being refused by a group of private bodies. Once again, Amazonia is being exploited, and nowadays we have at least two sustainable models of development of Amazonian rainforest in the whole area, preserving the biodiversity, the human side, and the natural side with a strong trend towards the conservation of the nature. Agroecology is quite related to this possibility. But how can we see this perspective from this point of view? It is quite related to it is quite related to these food chains and systems. So we have to think of dynamic processes and to keep working and using our practices of consumption, of trade, and so on, and all the elements that are present in this process. It is a cultural concept, so what we want to see in this model is the protection of the merchandise for this action with a great capacity to internationalize the produce in the security of a local net. The rights of traditional communities, they consume a great part of this food, of this produce, and they also use local markets. So it is important to mention this reference and to see it as a diversified system. There are different studies from different authors that prove that there is a diversity of those producers of those foods, but also the social side of it. Why? Because it helps people to have food the whole year around, and it is articulated with local systems such as to plant, to harvest, to process this food, and it also allows more global access to external market. This idea is of development of Amazon area is quite false. There is no need for development. We need to think of a program that would go along with the strategy of environment protection. For example, the forest system, the agricultural systems that Another important question is the acknowledgement of these Amazon systems. Those are not limited to the farmer's property. those are common areas like the rainforest and other places. So those collective practices and reciprocity that exists nowadays must be evaluated and supported. So in this case, the movements are fundamental. One of the movements presented as the idea of the collective use of human settlements and lands, and also there were anti-extractivist projects and so on. So without this reform, we won't achieve anything in regards of this biome. This is a problem of Amazonia. It's not enough to define the areas. It is also important to guarantee the respect to the wood logging and all those activities, that they have to be responsible. And another difference is a low level of use of modern technology in the agricultural system and technology. So basically, those technologies are not known in the area, and lately it is changing. The new technologies are coming, and the use of toxic chemical substances is being reduced. So it is important to think in the production strategies with the use of few external sources, and it is also a matter of use of organic produce, the management of produce, and so on. So in a great part of Amazonia, the technology historically has been present, but it has been improved. So we should think of this process of transition in case of management of the waters, the lakes, or those foods and produces such as acai, for example. But we cannot support the exploitation, the exploiting of this territory. So just to end my presentation, I would like to mention the importance of the policies that can encompass this perspective from the state point of view. There is a need for the policies that would support those processes in terms of conservation and preservation, for them to be flexible and be able to adapt to different systems. That was my contribution. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, basically, our time is almost over. I have a few notes, but I believe I will just mention a few main concepts. I believe that the most important part of all those comments and presentation is policies on these territories, the importance and sense, the importance of those territories in different aspects, the very different ones. For example, traditional peoples and many others. Many aspects they ask for that, and also it is important to mention the importance of agroecological perspectives, but also to remember what several people have mentioned, especially Fran, this transition to the reverse agroecology is so important. For example, the case of your father, those people that have already used this technology and those practices to come to go back to those technologies and to leave this situation where they were obliged to change this technology, to change this process, and while to apply this reverse process. So this is a key issue that has to be attended. So here I have a few notes in order to discuss them, but basically those are the differentiation of the system in this moment, and also the the subject related to the theory side, such as agriculture base. There are very well organized designs, very known designs of bioeconomy or ecological economy, and based on Amazon and reality. So I believe it is important issue to be promoted, but this territorial question is transcendental for us, as we've seen and as we've heard today. We've seen that the territories can be treated in a different way and can be very rich. I would like to thank our speakers of this session, and I also hope that we will receive interesting questions in our chat to answer them today and tomorrow. And also I would like to mention that the construction of this session in this moment, such a difficult moment that we all experience, it's a hope for everyone. Just to let you know that the Amazonia exists. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you.